But 2020 has been a year for the books, right? Kristen and I talk pretty often about our kids are going to be reading books someday and saying, yeah, I was alive during 2020. I didn't remember much of it, but that's what was going on. I remember that. And so I put the highlights. As I said, probably could have called these lowlights, but these are some top things that have happened this year. And it seems like anything bad that could happen has happened in the year 2020. Do you even remember at the beginning of the year, actually it started in 2019 and carried over in the beginning of this year, there was wildfires in Australia. And these wildfires actually burned 46 million acres. And they said 3 billion animals were affected by these wildfires. That's unbelievable. Then there was the fear of World War III. On January 3rd, the U.S. performed this drone strike. Remember, and it killed that major general. His name was Soleimani in Iran. And people were afraid Trump's going to get us into World War III, so we were afraid of that. Then the president was impeached and then later acquitted. And then, of course, COVID-19. How can we not talk about COVID-19? Been in quarantine. We're still dealing with that. And that started in March. You know, this year it seems like it's been the shortest, longest year ever. But COVID-19, still dealing with that. Well, then the economy sort of tanked because of COVID-19. Still dealing with that, although it's coming back up. If you invest in stock markets, things are looking better. But it was a pretty tough time period there. We had tornadoes in April of 2020 that hit Nashville. There was people's lives lost, caused a lot of damage. And then we had murder hornets that came out of the news in May. And these things, supposedly, if they stung you several times, they would kill you, these murder hornets. Then we've had social unrest, and that's still going on as well. I read an article about zombie cicadas in July. These zombie cicadas, supposedly they had eaten these mushrooms and they had this psychedelic effect on them and they couldn't, you know, they were just acting crazy. Now that only gets us through the first half of the year. Here we are in August. These stories are through July. That's pretty crazy stuff, isn't it? So, all of these things get you to wondering, well, what is going on? What's going on in the world? And maybe it starts making you think, maybe this is the end. Maybe this is the end because of everything bad that's happened. Vicki sent me an article at the beginning of this week, I think on Monday, about a man in Knoxville who believes that the things going on in the world indicates this is the end of the days. And he said he believes the Bible confirms the things that are happening are associated with the end of the world. I was driving yesterday on Williamsport Pike, and there's a Church of God there on the left, and their sign said, "These are the end times, are you ready?" And so I figured we'd spend some time talking about, is this the end? Are the things that we're seeing, do the Bible, these things line up with the Bible confirmation that these are the end of days? And that's what we want to spend some time talking about. So this isn't to scare us all, you know, to death where we can't function, but this is to take a realistic view of, are the things that we're seeing, is this the end? And so we'll spend a few minutes talking about that. All right, so the end times. I think we need to begin, and maybe this is sort of counterintuitive. We're trying to answer a question by asking 3 more questions, but I think as we ask these questions, we'll get the answer to what we're seeking. And the first thing I want to talk about is, are we living in the last days? And I want to focus on that phrase, last days, because the Bible talks about that. It mentions the phrase last days many times. We won't look at all the times that it's mentioned. But with everything going on in the world, with certain religious leaders saying the Bible predicts such things are happening, you may be wondering, are we living in the last days? Well, in Isaiah 2, in verse 2, there was a prophecy about the church. And it says, it shall come to pass, notice, in the last days, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above all the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. We talked last week about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and how the Old Covenant was for the Jewish people, the Israelites, and the New Covenant is for Jew and Gentile alike. And that's what this prophecy is saying. All nations will flow into it. The church is available for all. We can all be a part of the church. You don't have to be a certain nationality. This prophecy in Isaiah said in the last days, the church was going to be established. Okay? Remember in Acts chapter 2, when Peter on the day of Pentecost, we know very well Peter preached that sermon on Pentecost when the church was established. Peter quoted from the book of Joel chapter 2. And Peter said, beginning verse 16 of Acts 2, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. So, the things that are going on right now, Peter said, this is what Joel was talking about. It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my Spirit upon all flesh. I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So you read those things, you think, oh man, we've got the sun going to be turned into darkness, the moon into blood. What Peter said was the things that Joel talked about, that's happening right now. Peter said those things are happening right now. And he was just referring back to the prophecy that Joel made. And so that prophecy was going to happen in the last days. Isaiah said the church was going to be established in the last days. We know that the church was established in Acts chapter 2. And so you may be thinking, well, that doesn't really make much sense. How's it called the last days? History tells us that the church was established in AD 30 or AD 33. Almost 2,000 years ago, that was the last days. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would the Bible call that the last days? Well, when we look back through dispensations of time, we sort of get an understanding that last days doesn't mean last few days. If I say these are going to be the last few days at my job, these are going to be the last days here, then we would think, okay, I've only got maybe a week or less left to work. But the phrase in the Bible, last days, is talking about a period of time. And so, remember, there's the patriarchal age where God spoke to the fathers, the leaders of families, the heads of households. That's recorded in the book of Genesis. That's the patriarchal age. Then there was the Mosaical time period where God gave the law to Moses and people lived under the old law. That was that period of time where Israel was God's chosen people. Now we're in the Christian age. And that's the time period where God deals with mankind through Christ. The age of the church, however you want to put it. That's the age that we're living in now. And we've been living in that age for almost 2,000 years. So, we're in the last days. Notice in Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2, the Hebrew writer said, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the world. So the Hebrew writer tells us in the last days, all nations are being called into one kingdom. That's the church that Christ built. And this is that last age. Jesus came in the last times. And if the days of the gospel is the last times, that we're still in them. Peter said in 1 Peter 1 and verse 20, he said, who verily was foreordained, he's talking about Christ, he was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. Jesus came in the last times. It was planned before the world even began. God had that plan that Jesus was going to come. And so, there's no doubt about it. We are in the last days. We're in the last times. Jesus came in the last times. In 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 5, there's some things that we're told was going to happen in the last days. And that's what Paul told to Timothy. He said, this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. Men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. Now, if you wanted to put a description on what our world looks like today, I think you could start right there, and that'd be a pretty good description telling you what our world's like. That's the way people conduct themselves today. But Paul told this to Timothy long ago, and he said in the last days that they were in then, that's the way people were going to act. That's the way people were going to conduct themselves. Unfortunately, we still see people conducting themselves that way. And so it's a pretty sad but fitting description of what we see in the last days. So, to answer the question, are we living in the last days? Yes, we are. We've been in the last days for a little under 2,000 years. We're in the last dispensation of time. So, we're living in the last days. What about this question? Are things worse now than they ever been before? I think this is an important question because I think people will look at the news. By the way, I know we've commented several times. They should call it bad news. The news isn't going to report feel good stories. It's not going to happen. It's going to be negative things. But you turn on the news and you see bad story after bad story. Things are getting worse. Things are terrible. They couldn't get any worse, could they? And you start thinking, things must be worse now than they've ever been before. And so we won't talk about that yet. Are they? Are things worse now than they've ever been before? I think that's a good question to try to answer. Again, when people feel like the end of the world is near, they'll cite, well, things are worse now than they've ever been. Look how bad things are. And they'll talk about maybe the moral decline of our world, maybe our country in particular. They'll say maybe many are turning their backs on God. God's been taken out of schools, out of homes, etc. And those things are true. But are things worse now than they've ever been? I think it's a mistake if we try to imagine that. We're dealing with the worst times ever now. I think it's a mistake if we try to imagine that this is the worst it's ever been. What about the world's condition in Noah's day? In Genesis 6 and verse 5, it says, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's a pretty bad situation in Noah's day. And how many people made it out alive in Noah's day? Remember, the flood came and there was 8 souls that were saved. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives. 8 people of the world in that day were saved. Now, we look around the room this morning. Consider our group here today. We've got a pretty good sized little group here today. There's more than 8 people here today, and so we can say there's more than 8 people, even right here, right now, trying to live right. We're not perfect in that, and don't claim to be, but we're trying to live right. In the whole world in Noah's day, only 8 people were saved. But here today, there's groups like ours meeting all over the world. There's people trying to live right. There's Christians today trying to live right. And so things are bad. We don't deny that fact. But are things worse than they've ever been? I don't think we can say that. In Noah's day, things were pretty bad. Only 8 souls were saved. What about in Romans chapter 1, Paul wrote about the condition of the Gentiles. Now, we are Gentile people. We are not Jews. But in this context, he's not talking about nationality. He's talking about Gentiles as used to describe people of the world. They're Gentile people. People of the world are not living for God. This is the condition of how the Gentiles are living. In Romans 1 and verse 28, Paul said, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. What does that word mean? We don't use that in everyday language, reprobate. Well, reprobate means debased, depraved, or wicked. So God gave them over to a wicked mind, reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. This is pretty similar to what Paul told Timothy, but again, if we were going to put a description on our country, this would be a pretty fitting one. There's all kinds of evil things going on. I've seen people point out inventors of evil things and talk about movies and the things that are going on in our media. I think that's fitting. There's a whole lot of evil going on today. There was a whole lot of evil things going on in Paul's day, or else he wouldn't have been writing about these things. So they were happening then, just as unfortunately they're happening now. Now, Paul wrote this book about 1900 years ago, and those words still fit today. And so there's evil in the world then, there's evil in the world today. And so in some respects, things haven't changed all that much. But again, the idea that we're trying to establish is that we shouldn't start thinking, well, things today are just worse than they've ever been. They're so much worse now. They're bad. We're not trying to say things are good, but what we're saying is things are worse now than they've ever been. What about in Judges 21 and verse 25? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So, you've got no law and order in this situation. Everybody, it's just a free-for-all. I read this and I think about the wild, wild west. People are just going and taking, they want something, they'll go and try to fight you for it and take it from you. And you got to fight for your life every day and fight for your family every day. we're not in that situation. There's been some scary things happen. There's bad things happen, unfortunately. We live in an evil world. But we're not in that kind of situation. We may be headed that way, but we're not in that kind of situation. I haven't had to fight for my life because I profess to be a Christian, for instance. People in the first century are being burned at the stake for confessing that they were a Christian. So things are bad, but things are not as bad or not worse than they've always been. That's the point we're making. Now, I think when we try to answer this question, Matthew 24 is undoubtedly always brought up when talking about the end of the world scenarios. And I just want to talk about that for just a minute. In Matthew 24, beginning in verse 1, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So there's two questions asked here. Jesus told them that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So there's not going to be one left here, one stone upon another. And so they asked him two questions. They said, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? So I don't know whether they thought Jerusalem being destroyed necessarily meant the world was going to end or not. But there's two different questions. And in the book of Matthew 24, just be aware, as people will bring up Matthew 24, be aware that Jesus has answered two questions. The first question he's answering is the destruction of Jerusalem. When will those things be? The destruction of Jerusalem. That's what he starts answering in verse 4. Jesus said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. So, it's interesting that Matthew 24 is used to describe the end times in these verses, because people say, these are bad, there's wars, there's natural disasters, there's been tsunamis and hurricanes that have wiped out cities. We hear of famine sometimes in foreign countries. Yeah, we're still dealing with a pandemic here. Social and political unrest. Doesn't that all mean something? It's interesting that Jesus, in answering the question, again, he's answering the question about Jerusalem being destroyed. When will that happen? And he told them, well, you're going to hear about all these kind of things. There's going to be wars. You're going to hear about nation rising up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. You're going to hear about famines and pestilences and earthquakes. He's just saying those are things that are going to happen. They're going to continue to happen. That's not a sign of Jerusalem being destroyed, is what he was asking. So it's interesting that even taken out of context, it doesn't answer the question that people are looking for. Things like that are going to happen. We live in a wicked world. You know, I was thinking yesterday when I was preparing to talk about this to you this morning that I've never lived in a time where, a draft has happened, where we're forced to go to war. I haven't lived through anything like that. I imagine when World War I and World War II were going on, that was a pretty difficult time for people here. People were leaving their families, not knowing if they were going to return. Families were seeing their father and brother and uncles and cousins going off to war. That's a very difficult thing. I can't even imagine. But that has happened. I've never had to deal with anything like that. How difficult of a time would that be? Very difficult, I think. But we're trying to answer the question, are things worse now than they've ever been before? There's been wars. There will be famines. There will be things like that. We live in a sin-cursed world. But just because we see a hurricane, that doesn't mean that things are just worse now than they've ever been before. That's the point that we're making. Things like that are going to happen. So, are we living in the last days? Yes. Are things worse now than ever before? Things are bad, but I don't think we can say things are just worse now than they've ever been before. All right. Let's answer a third question. Will there be signs showing that the end is near? Will there be a sign? Can we turn to our Bible and say, yep, I'm seeing it. That happened, and this happened, and that happened, and this must mean that the end is near. Can we do that? Now, there are a lot of people that will tell you yes. I listened to an audio sermon of a guy last night, who said yes, and he was going to the Old Testament and the book of Revelation and saying this is what this means and this is what this means, and he was drawing a direct line. And we're not going to look at all of it. We just don't have time to look at all those passages today. But we are going to answer the question, are there going to be signs showing the end is near? People are always intrigued to find a meaning for everything. I've worked with people in the past, and even currently I work with people that believe that everything's going on points to the end of the world. This is the end of the world because of everything that's going on. Again, people will find obscure references in the Bible and say, that's what this means. That's what this means. It's happening now. You know how many predictions there have been about when the world is going to end? Hundreds upon hundreds. Just Google it. There's hundreds. You'll find a list. In recent times, I'll just offer you two. The year 2000, Y2K. Remember, everybody thought the computers are going to crash. They're not going to be able to deal with flipping over to 2000. Everything's going to crash. The world's going to end as we know it. Remember that? Then, more recently, in the year 2012, remember that? The Mayan calendar was supposed to run out in 2012. And the Mayans were highly intelligent mathematicians, and they came up with this calendar. It was really neat what they did. And they put this calendar out way in advance, but they stopped it in 2012. And so people came along and said, Mayan calendar ends in 2012. It must mean that the world's going to end on September 21st or whatever it was of 2012. Well, that was 8 years ago. They were wrong there, too. What about all these predictions that the world is going to end? Well, we just looked at Matthew chapter 24. Again, we said there were two questions Jesus was answering. When is Jerusalem going to be destroyed? Their second question is, what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24 verse 36? Of that day, of the end of the world, of that day and hour knoweth certain people that are really smart and know this. No, of that day and hour knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And he says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, I don't know how to make anything more clear than that. Jesus said, of that day and hour knoweth no man. He says, my Father only. Actually, Jesus, the way he constructs this is that he doesn't know. The Father only knows. Now, if Jesus doesn't know when the world's going to end, why should I sit here and think, well, I can figure this thing out. I can put together some numbers and I can try to predict. That's foolish. My goal isn't to be mean, but as plainly as I can say it, if a person comes along and tells you they know when the world's going to end, plainly they are lying. They are lying because they do not know. Jesus said there's not going to be any advanced warning. There's not going to be any sign. He said just like before the flood, people were living their lives. They were marrying. They were being given in marriage. They were eating and drinking. They were living life. And then the flood came. And so he says, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. There's not going to be an advanced warning. So we are living in the last days, but we're not going to be able to turn to Matthew 24 and line up things that are happening in the year 2020 and say, see, that's it. That's it. No, we don't know. The world is going to end. It's going to end when God, the Father, decides it's time. Now, each day takes us closer to the end. Today is closer than yesterday, but that doesn't mean we know when it's going to come. We just don't. And so anyone who claims to know, as we said, they're just not telling you the truth. He goes on in Matthew 24, verse 42. Jesus said, watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Now Jesus makes an interesting comparison to a person, the homeowner, the good man, watching his house because it's going to be robbed. And he just says, if you know when your house is going to be robbed, you're going to be watching, you're going to be ready. But Jesus is going to come in such an hour as you think not. When you're not expecting it, it's going to come. Now, I don't know about you, but how many people know when will be the next time that they're robbed? You don't know that, do you? Thankfully, we've never been robbed before. But you can't know if that's going to happen. Typically, when people are going to rob you, they're planning. They're going to wait till in the middle of the night or wait till you're not home. They're going to do that in secret. You don't know. And so maybe if you live in a rough neighborhood and you think, yeah, that's highly likely that I'm going to get robbed in the near future, maybe you can do that, but you just don't know. It's unexpected. If you knew it was going to happen, you could be prepared. Robbers don't usually come and say, hey, tomorrow night, I'm going to come rob your house. That's not how that works. They wait till it's an unexpected time. Right? Those are simple things. Jesus said that's exactly what it's going to be like when the Son of Man comes. Paul reiterates the same thing. He says in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 2, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. It's going to happen unexpectedly. Maybe we're not going to be prepared for that, and it's going to happen. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Tommy read for us in 2 Peter chapter 3. This is a really interesting set of verses here. And so we'll try to read through them slowly and get the big picture. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 beginning. Peter says, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days, there's our phrase again. So in the last days, what's going to happen? There's going to come scoffers. There's going to be people mocking and making fun of you people that are being Christians. And they're going to walk after their own lust, saying, where is the promise of his coming? You all are talking about Jesus is coming. Where's it at? I'm not seeing any signs that Jesus is coming. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store. Okay, so people are going to come, they're going to be mocking and scoffing, and they're going to say, I'm not seeing the world ending. You people keep talking about that. I'm not seeing anything like that. He said they're ignorant because the fact of the word of God that made the earth, that made the heavens, that same word is still keeping, by the same word, are kept in store. The earth is still standing by the same word of God. He's still upholding the earth right now. The sun came up this morning because God wanted it to come up. We get rain because there's rain. God sends the rain. All right? So God is holding the world up. It says, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day as with the Lord, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. We don't need to get to thinking that. Jesus said he was coming back, but it's been 2,000 years. That doesn't mean anything. Time, God exists outside of time. So one day to him is like 1,000 years to us, and 1,000 years to us is like a day to God. We don't need to be questioning things because of that. Why hasn't Christ returned yet? Well, in 2 Peter 3, verse 9, he says, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to us, for not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. God's long-suffering. He's given an opportunity for people to get in the right standing with him, and so he's holding off. We ought to be thankful for that. There's people that we're working on. We want them to get in a good standing with God. We ought to be thankful for his patience. But notice in verse 10, he says, but the day of the Lord will come. The day of the Lord is coming. It's going to come like a thief in the night. There's our phrase again. In which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. I've had people ask me, do you believe in global warming? And I say, I absolutely do. And we're reading about it right here in 2 Peter 3. Because the earth is going to be burned up when Christ returns. The earth and the works therein. It's going to be gone. Where we're standing right now will be no more when Christ returns. And so, it's been 2,000 years we've been in the last days. But Jesus is coming. And he's going to come like a thief in the night. And when that happens, this whole world and all the works therein are going to be done away with. All right. So a quick look at the end times. There's a whole lot more that can be said. We can look at a bunch of different references, and we may do that sometime. But the point I want to make is people are talking now, it's even on the news now, people are saying it's the end times. We know it because of all these things that are going on. But hopefully the questions we've answered are helpful. We're living in the last days. We don't need to think that things are worse now than ever before. Things are bad. So don't hear what I'm not saying. Things are bad. Things aren't good. But there's been worse times before. We've seen the world kind of cycles through good, maybe better, and worse times. Seems like now we're in one of those worse times, downfalls. But we can't say that things are worse today than they've ever been. Will there be signs showing the end is near? There will not. It's going to come like a thief in the night. So we don't need to watch the news and think, oh, that's it. That's what the Bible talked about. Jesus said that nobody knows except his Father only. You know, a Christian has to be ready at all times for the sudden arrival of Christ. We won't have a chance to make last-minute preparations. We talk about Jesus coming like a thief in the night. Do you make preparations when you leave your house? I'm assuming we all do, right? You lock your door. It's a shame we have to do that. Used to, growing up, we never locked our door. You got to lock your door now. You got an alarm system. Because unfortunately, there's people that will break in and try to steal. We take those preparations. We prepare. We don't know when the thief's coming, but we prepare. We don't know when Jesus is coming, but we need to be prepared. We won't have time when he comes to make last-minute preparations. I won't have time to scurry around and try to get my life right with God. It's too late then. It's too late. So we know that Jesus is coming. The question is, are you ready? Are you ready for that? And that's what we want to ask you right now. Consider your life and consider, are you ready for the coming of Christ? He's coming. I don't know when that's going to happen. Nobody does. But we need to be ready. If you need assistance in getting your life right with God today, we'd be happy to help you. If you'd like to study more, if you'd like to talk about it, please just say a word. If you need to obey the gospel plan of salvation, which is hear, believe, repent, confess, and then be baptized for the remission of sin, we'd be happy to help you do that even today. If you feel like your life isn't right with God, you feel like you've been an erring Christian, you need the prayers of the church here, we'd be happy to pray for you and with you. We'd ask you to come forward if you have a need while we stand and sing this invitation song.